I've been playing League of Legends off and on since 2010, and after all that time, I can honestly say I've never liked solo queue. The rage, the tilt, the flame, from the hardcore running it down to the passive aggressive inting, it all sucks. Rather than be fun, solo queue always seemed like part babysitting, part counseling, and part some twisted psychological experiment. But with a 5-man, all those problems wash away. As a team, League's fundamental essence is revealed in all of its glory, and once you see it, going back to the shadow that is solo queue is impossible. My name is Randomonium, and I'm the jungler for Apes Together Strong. I discovered the amateur League of Legends scene back in 2015. Back then, most tournaments weren't structured teams. You simply signed up and got placed on a random team for the weekend. It was a lot of fun, and if you did well, you could win RP prizes, or you could even win the Triumphant Rise skin. But one downside was that you never really get to build relationships with players long term. There was just way too much churn for any stable team to form. The amateur scene has evolved considerably since those days. Now we have fully functional leagues with organized teams split into divisions based on rank, competing in multi-month seasons complete with playoffs and prizes. Some teams have even grown into full organizations with multiple teams in different ranked leagues. The league that I've been a part of for the past year or so is the Casual Esports Amateur League, or SEAL for short. I've competed in SEAL since their inaugural Season 0, and I've had a different roster every season. Where we're going to start our story is in Season 4 of SEAL, just as the playoffs are about to begin. Why are we starting in the playoffs, you ask? That's a long story, but the short version is our team completely disintegrated during the regular split. We had constant fighting, near daily battles of who did what wrong, and we even descended into a lot of passive-aggressive behavior or outright refusing to talk to teammates. I had seen this type of stuff before, and it usually results in the team completely imploding and forfeiting the remainder of their matches. We were lucky though. When the dust settled, 3 of our starters had left, but I and our mid laner Charn remained. Thankfully for us, we had started the season 7-1 before everyone had succumbed to madness and toxicity, and even though our record had dropped to 8-6, it was still good enough to squeak into playoffs as the number 4 seed. We just needed a team. First to join the roster was Uncle, our former support who had decided to take a season off, but came back in our hour of need to save the team. From there, Charn and Uncle recruited their friends Blaney and Slavic Goon for top lane and bot lane, respectively. Even more miraculously, all of our replacements were of equivalent rank to the players that we lost, which meant that we could make these substitutions without losing any bans for our upcoming playoff matches. So now we had 5 players, but we weren't a team yet. Becoming a team takes time, and we only had a few weeks until our first playoff match. The little practice we were able to have, though, was extremely promising. Our win rate together in those first few days was well over 80%. Our team was exceptionally talented, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we could carry from every single role. Amateur leagues are very different from Flex Queue though. In Flex Queue, you can get by on outplays and snowballing the game through player tilt. Amateur leagues are much more difficult. The teams are much more coordinated. They've had time to scout your team, and they've come prepared with draft strategies to exploit your weaknesses and ban your favorite champions. Amateur teams are also much more resilient to snowballing in tilt. They know how to adapt when they're behind, and they trust each other to carry even when things look grim. This is where I come in. In addition to being the team's jungler, I'm also the team's scouter and draft analyst. I make sure the team is never caught unprepared and that we always win our draft. My methods are a little complex, but I'm going to give you guys an all-access pass on how we scout our opponents and prepare a draft strategy. Through this series, I'm also going to give you access to our in-game comms so you can see how we fight as a team rather than 5 individuals. The way this series is going to work is that each episode is going to focus on a single game from our playoff run, starting with the scouting and draft planning for that game and ending with our post-game chat. In order for you to understand the scouting and draft planning though, I need to bring you into my world and show you the tool that I've created for my team. On the screen right now is a blank version of the tool that I've made. I provided the link to this Google Sheet in the video description below, so if you want to use it for your team, feel free to copy or modify it to suit the needs of your team. So the first thing your team needs to do is fill out column AN with each person's champion pool. Champions should be organized from most willing to play to least willing to play. Try to find a balance between making your champion pool too big or too small. Too big and filling out the rest of the scouting plan will take a bunch more time. Too small and you'll severely limit your options in developing a draft plan. If possible, try to have at least 10 champions per role. Next, you need to fill out column R for the champion pools of the team that you're going to face. Obviously, your opponent is not going to give you an ordered list of their champion preferences, so here's where the hard work of scouting actually begins. For scouting champion pools, I mainly use op.gg and whatever game records the amateur league has. When I'm scouting an opponent, the first thing I look at is what champions they normally play in their amateur league matches. The reason for this is which champions someone plays in solo queue doesn't always match up with what champions they're willing to play in a competitive amateur league. This is especially true with Feast or Famine champions like Assassins. Feast or Famine champions are commonly picked in solo queue because you can't trust the random monkeys you've been paired up with, so you want to make yourself the win condition. Feast or Famine champions also perform better in solo queue because they usually prey on the lack of communication and the lack of coordination of the enemy team. Amateur teams are much more coordinated and they're always in voice comms, which makes Feast or Famine champions much more of a gamble. For that reason, you always want to prioritize the champions the player plays in their amateur league matches over what they play in solo queue. However, don't forget to look at what champions their opponents ban in those amateur matches. It may be that the only reason why a player isn't playing a Feast or Famine champion is because it's always getting banned against them. After looking at amateur games, the next place I build an opponent's champion pool is from their flex queue games with their teammates and their clash games. I tend to ignore the normal games a player plays unless they're really spamming a champion, because normal games are usually where players practice champions they're uncomfortable with rather than something they plan on busting out in the next match. My general rule is if they're not willing to play it in a flex game, they're probably not willing to play it in an amateur league. The reason why I prioritize looking at flex games and clash games over solo queue is similar to why I prioritize amateur league games over solo queue. Players play differently in coordinated play than in solo queue. After the flex and clash games, I look at a player's solo queue. Most players are willing to play in an amateur match anything that they play regularly in solo queue. They may just not prefer it over some of the other champions. So it's important to include that player's solo queue champion pool as possible champions that they could play. The last thing I do with each player is I check their champion mastery on champions. Some players have pocket picks that they hide in solo queue, but they're willing to bust out in key moments like playoffs. The only way to spot these champions is to look for high champion mastery. Most amateur leagues also have rules that players need to disclose all Smurf accounts above a particular level. If your amateur league has this rule, be sure to check if the player you are scouting has any Smurfs and see what champions they've been spamming on those accounts as well. This is what I consider to be the bare minimum needed to build a competent draft plan, that you clearly identify your champion pools and your opponent's champion pools. However, we never do just the minimum on my team. The next step is we identify all champions within the opponent's champion pool that have a favorable matchup into each of the champions within our champion pool. This helps us identify how safe a champion is and helps us define what champions and or roles can be blind picked and what champions and or roles need to be saved for counter picks. This list of champions that counter each of our champions is filled out in columns AO through BF and arranged from the hardest counter in AO to the weakest counter in BF. Once these columns are filled out, I sum all the possible counters for each champion in column AM, which gives us a blind pick score. Where the lower the score is, the better a blind pick the champion is. There's plenty of statistical websites that can help you identify counter matchups. My personal favorite right now is u.gg because I feel like its matchup tab for each champion provides the most information compared to other sites. One caveat of looking at matchups is it's usually better to look at the statistics from the previous patch rather than the current patch because the previous patch usually has a larger sample size of games than the current patch. After we figured out the best champions our opponent could play to counter each of our champions, we do the reverse and analyze what are the best picks that we could pick into each of their champions. This is done in columns S through AK. You can use information from statistical websites like u.gg for this analysis, or you can rely on your own matchup knowledge if you're really familiar with both champions. The goal is to identify at least 6 champions that we feel comfortable playing into each of their champions, because the opponent can ban 5 champions, so you want to plan for worst case. If you have access to how your opponents drafted in their previous amateur matches, the next area to fill out is cells L17 through P27. This is more of an optional step, but it can give some amazing insight into the team if you have access to that data. For example, my league uses ProDraft and posts the links to all of the Pro Drafts after the matches. From these Pro Drafts, I can see how each team prioritizes their bans and picks. This allows you to make some really clever choices in the pick ban phase. For example, if you know that their support usually picks second on red side or third on blue side, then that allows you to know that it's advantageous for you to hold on to your support pick so you can counter on blue 3 or red 3. This can also be done to give you more flexibility in your bans. For example, if there's one champion that their mid laner plays that you're really worried about, most teams would just use a first rotation ban to get rid of that champion. However, if you know that their mid laner almost always picks their champion during the second pick phase, you can often delay that ban to second ban phase, which frees you up to ban an additional champion in first ban phase. If you have access to the pro drafts or match history of your opponent, you can also fill out K60 through P90 to see what champions have a high presence in the amateur games that the team plays. Pick is how many times they played that champion. Ban is how many times the enemy team banned that champion. Steal is how many times the enemy team stole the champion before your opponent could pick it. Finding steals is a bit harder, but you want to look for times when the enemy team picked one of your opponent's most played champions early in the draft. Sum them all together to get the total. Presence is the sum of the pick, ban, and steal divided by the total number of amateur games your opponent has played. At the start of an amateur season, this data is not very useful, but towards the end of the season and in playoffs, this data is extremely useful. The final thing you can do for scouting is watch VODs of the amateur games your opponent has recently played and take some notes in K38 through K58. When watching these VODs, it's important to think of what you would do in their situation and see what they do instead. If they do something very different than what you would have done, then that's an important note to take because it often indicates something that they either do really well or something that they do badly that you can exploit. Pay attention to how they set up their level 1. Do they 5-point and cover all of the jungle entrances, or do they AFK under tower? If it's the latter, then they're prime targets for a level 1 invade. Does the jungler take the same path every match? If so, then that's exploitable. Do the laners ward at very specific times and in specific locations? That's also exploitable. Do they frequently go for early drakes or rift heralds, or do they conversely rarely have vision on those neutral objectives? More things you can exploit. Every team has weaknesses, patterns, and bad habits. Learn to identify them and punish them accordingly. At this point, scouting is complete, and you have everything that you need to start developing a draft strategy, but there's still a lot of work to go to developing a full-fledged draft strategy. The first thing I do for draft strategies is try to figure out the best blind picks and the best bans for each role. This is filled out in cells K1 through P13 on my draft plan. Defining what the best bans and the best blind picks definitely requires a bit of a subjective assessment. For blind picks, the score in column AM can be a good start if you filled it out for each champion, but it's not the only thing you should be looking at. In particular, you don't want your blind picks to be easily countered by any of their most played champions, even if the corresponding blind pick score is low. The major caveat to this is if you're for sure planning to ban one of their most commonly played champions that counters your blind pick. I really cannot stress the importance of finding good blind picks enough. Blind picks straight up make or break a draft plan. You're never going to have to blind pick every role, but it's important to identify blind picks for every role because it helps you identify what are the best and worst roles to blind pick for that particular opponent. In general, bot lane and jungle are usually the easiest roles to blind pick, but you never want to assume that's true because there are circumstances where blind picking top, mid, or support is the right decision. Identifying the best bans is also very subjective. On rare occasions, you're going to go up against people who are 1 or 2 tricks, which makes banning easy, but in general, my experience has been that most people playing in amateur leagues have pretty diverse champion pool. What I typically look for are champions that the opponents could blind pick that we don't have many counters for, or champions that they could flex to multiple positions. Taking away key blind picks and flex picks from your opponent can completely throw off their draft. Just as good blind picks can win you the draft, denying good blind picks and flex picks from your opponent can also win you the draft. With bans, you often want to assess how much bang for your buck the ban gives you. For example, if their mid laner plays 4 assassins, then putting 1 ban towards an assassin doesn't really do much for you because he still has 3 others that he can play. Conversely, if there's a support who mainly plays tanks, but he has 1 pick that doesn't fall within the tank role, you could ban that champion knowing that it will force him to play a tank, and then you can prepare a counter into his tank champion pool. Ultimately, figuring out the correct bans has a lot of risk assessment involved. You only get 3 bans for the first rotation, so your opponent is guaranteed to get at least a few of the picks that they want. Identifying what champions are annoying versus game losing is huge. Always assume worst case and develop a plan for each worst case scenario. Once you've figured that out, it's time to put yourself in your opponent's shoes and try to figure out the best champions they could ban against you and put those bans in K31 through O35. The colors indicate the likelihood of a champion being banned. This allows you to identify potential single points of failure within your draft strategies. This also helps you bound what the worst case scenario is so you can develop plans for those scenarios. The goal is to make the draft phase almost robotic, where regardless of what they pick, you have a clear pre-planned response. If they first pick A, then we insta-lock X and Y. There's even a psychological aspect to this when you're in the draft. Accelerating the tempo of the draft and locking in picks rapid fire can cause opponents to second guess themselves and potentially bait them into bad picks. At this point, everything to the right of column J should be filled out in your draft plan. Now it's time to condense all of that information into an actual draft plan in columns A through I. The important thing with draft plans is not to be too rigid with them. It's fine to have concrete first picks or bands, but when you get to the later bands and picks, you want to have multiple possibilities. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, so you don't want to paint yourself into a corner by over-specifying what your plan is. Typically, I generally know what our first two bands are, and then the third band is often a little bit situational. I also typically identify several champions that we identify as first pick worthy, because chances are they're going to ban at least one of your first pick worthy champs. For the second and third picks, I usually identify either several champions that would work, or I specify the role that I would most likely want to pick in those positions. I found that players are often much more prepared to say what champion they want to play if you at least let them know what their most likely pick order is. When you get down to the fourth and fifth picks, I rarely have them better defined than the role that I want to pick in that position, but even that is not set in stone. When you first start coming up with these draft strategies, it's probably going to feel a little weird, and chances are you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Just get your ideas down on paper and slowly iterate them with the feedback you get from your team. Time permitting, it's often very smart to run through mock drafts with your teammates using pro drafts to see what holes there are in your draft strategies. Always try to put yourself in the mind of your opponent. The better you can do that, the more your mock drafts will help you. When running through these mock drafts, it's important to devote at least some of the time to the absolute worst case scenarios, because those are the scenarios that will expose the most flaws in your plan. Things like triple banning a single role and stealing picks that your team wanted to play are two examples of possible worst case scenarios. Now you know everything that we go through to scout and develop a draft plan for each opponent. It's a lot of work, but we feel like it's really worth the effort. I'm sure some of you are wondering why we're revealing our secrets like this. The truth is we believe that a rising tide raises all ships. We feel that by sharing our secrets with you, everyone will improve, and in turn, it will make us better in the long run. Furthermore, we feel that this spirit of collaboration is something that we should try to encourage more within the League community, and we actively welcome constructive criticism to our methods and tactics. For example, if you feel like you've improved on the tool that I showed in this video, please share it with us. We'd love to check it out. Our story is just beginning, but this is all I have for you right now. Tune in to our next episode to see if all of our planning and strategizing pays off in our quarterfinal match. You definitely don't want to miss it.